Well, I'm going to get started here. And yeah, happy to be back, little by little getting my voice back, and really enjoyed the conversation that I had with a meditation mind community member last Friday. Just really enjoyed it. Yeah, unfortunately, I kind of realized that, when you're in conversation with someone and you're listening and or at least when you're me, I can't speak for you, but when you're me, the more invested that I get in the conversation, the more I'm liable to misspeak. And what I mean by that is, I'll just tell you what my definition for myself is of not being mindful of my speech, which, yeah, we're going to get to right speech later on down the road. And I'm not saying that this is what I'm just, kind of letting you know. And sometimes I'll in conversation, I'll talk a little bit more in a gritty fashion, kind of my conditioned history. Not definitely not with the intention of being divisive in any way, but more as an effort or an attempt to help provide a relatable touchstone to a potential audience that might be there, or community member who maybe is looking for something like I was when I was learning about some of the ideas in Buddhism, which are quite frankly just so esoteric. It's like, what? Anywho, so yeah, unfortunately my life's a little bit too busy to make the editing process on these weekly episodes be long. So I'm not going to be able to kind of share the reading load and kind of do that format anymore. So my apologies, community, but you're still always welcome. All right, so we are now, this is probably the most reading I will ever have been able to have gotten done. And this is episode 23, so in 23 episodes. And the reason why is because we are now officially in territory that is so outside of the scope of my culture and my upbringing and my childhood and my conditioning. And it is also, as I've repeatedly said, such a stretch and a reach for me that I feel it best to just read. And if I feel like I'm even remotely close to having something intelligent to say about what I'm reading, then, I'll proffer it up. But if you don't hear me being the typical peanut gallery today, it's because I'm really ignorant here in the domain of rebirth. And we're now on the page 118 of On the Path. This would be, I think, what is this? The second, I think, or third paragraph. Well, anyway, you'll see it's a subheading there, right? Rebirth. So I'm just going to get on into it and we'll see how this goes down. Rebirth. The Buddha sketched out the various levels of the cosmos to which one can be reborn, but he never provided a complete map of all the levels. Still, he did provide enough of a sketch to show how rebirth corresponds to actions. For instance, on the highest levels of heaven, there are beings whose states of bliss and rapture correspond in descending order to the formless concentration attainments, in which one takes as one's object perceptions such as nothingness, infinite consciousness, or infinite space, to the form levels of jhana, in which one takes as one's object the inner form of the body, and to intense sensual pleasures, corresponding to the results of generosity, virtue, and goodwill. Okay, so I went out and I did a little bit of research and came back, and I don't really know that I want to talk about this because I don't feel that I'm equipped to do it at the highest levels of heaven. I think where where the context would help me is, are they saying that in these higher, in this highest level, does one live in this state permanently? Or are they saying in this highest level, one has experienced it, but may not have access to it all the time? But you know what? Perhaps I have to assume that the highest level means, yeah, they live there. Have I ever met anyone in my life, in real life, who lives there? No, I have not. I've definitely met people who are a lot closer to living there than I am. And it's who are, who practice and yet somehow also, and not, I shouldn't say and yet somehow, they practice and they're Buddhist. And so, they're spending some time thinking about their death probably, and they're spending quite a bit of time thinking about suffering. And then you can just get into a room with them, and maybe spend like half an hour to 45 minutes of your week with them. And, you just feel like you got a massage, for your heart. There's a steadfastness there. There's a groundedness, and what it reminds me of, look at me, I'm already going off. See, I said I wouldn't, and look at this, it's already happening. It really does remind me though, well, I am going to go on. Okay, let's just go on. Human rebirth corresponds to a more mixed bag of ripening karmic seeds. And per the usual, my question is answered immediately. So if I would just learn, right? Where are those karmic seeds ripening? Human rebirth corresponds to a more mixed bag, right? I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. A more mixed bag of ripening karmic seeds, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. The different levels of beauty, wealth, power, lifespan, and status that different human beings experience depend on the relative abundance or lack of the seeds of generosity, virtue, and goodwill ripening in the bag. And it's funny because, again, if I can put my kind of, again, I think it's Buddhist. I think that this is a Buddhist term, Shenpa. The teacher that I have for embodiment coaching, Embodiment Unlimited, I'm just going to say it because I had such a great experience there with their Keck program. But in all seriousness, he calls them trolls, but I'm sure we can all relate. There's a lot of different terms out there, but it's a pretty universal feeling, I suspect. That idea when we just feel kind of pricked, like jealous, angry, just, the teeth on edge that, I didn't like what that guy thinks or says, don't like the shirt, whatever it is, right? Well, that gets to be our work, right? That gets to be our work. So yeah, what's ripening in our bag. I've talked about this already. How I just choose to hold the more supernatural. Well, Buddhism is supernatural, but Karma is central to Buddhism. So to my view, I choose to just I just want to hold an open frame. And when I can do that, then the idea of karma feels really logical to me. And I would say for someone who it doesn't feel logical for, I get that, believe you me. I definitely get that as a lifelong skeptic. But I think that, there are many aspects of secular Buddhism in the West that I really appreciate. Also, I know I get very kind of grumbly. Hi there, welcome. I get very grumbly about the West's interpretation of Buddhism sometimes, but they're, secular. Oh, and let me just tell you too, Drew, I am recording for my podcast, and if you would like to find out the book that I'm reading, you can see that in the thread that's in that link under book club, and I'm on page 118, and I'm on the paragraph that's talking about rebirth. Yeah. So, I think I'll just I'll kind of move it on down the road. But the passage I was reading was, human rebirth corresponds to a more mixed bag of ripening karmic seeds. So I'm just going to continue reading here. Below the human level are the levels to which beings are reborn from having engaged in unskillful actions. First going downward is the level of the hungry ghosts, whose food is the merit dedicated to them. Whose food is the merit dedicated to them. This often happens too. I almost said I don't use names here to protect yourself, but you might get to hear some things that nobody else does, because oftentimes when I'm reading this, because I'm not a scholar, I will go back in and do some research on the stuck areas, and then maybe go back in and lay down if I find out new information. And if there's nobody here, then I'll do that in real time. But yeah, this is definitely one that I'll want to read up on more, just that particular passage. First going downward is the level of the hungry ghosts, whose food is the merit dedicated to them. This level is not discussed in detail in the suttas, but later Buddhist texts depict the hungry ghosts as just that: hungry, poor, and miserable, often extremely so, from having been ungenerous in previous lives. Below them are the many varieties of common animals, and below them are the levels of hell. Although the suttas contain very few descriptions of heaven, they contain some very graphic descriptions of hell. Sutta 93. Examples of the Buddha's policy of saying disagreeable things when the time and place called for it. Oftentimes, anytime I'm talking about karma, and I was just saying right before you got on the call, how it's a stretch for me. It's mental gymnastics, and I apply beginner's mind as much as I'm egoically able to the supernatural elements of Buddhism, which I did not grow up with. And so, it's, again, going back to the introduction of the book, and, I'm sure we'll see again, I'm a byproduct of fabricated conditioning, and so believing that we recycle is just not an easy reach for me. And when I came into Buddhism in my early 20s, I came in via Tibetan Buddhism, and really didn't stay very long, because it was out of my purview of just being able to connect, feeling accessible. It was really more of the practice itself that kind of kept me interested in Buddhist ethics and the teachings of the historical Buddha. But at any rate, so, I'll just speak on this, of how I work with this idea as a lay Buddhist who's a Westerner and who came up in a secular home. Like, I don't know anything about an actual physical hell realm, or an actual physical heaven realm. I do know that I have been meditating a long time, and I've also had experiences where I've sat for ridiculous amounts of time and have had things happen in my mind that certainly feel like hell. And I've had things happen in my mind that certainly feel like heaven. And when you sit long enough, I find that you also start to see how you cling to the things that feel like heaven, and you try to avoid the things that feel like hell. And this happens to varying degrees, and I think it's very individual. Earlier today, I dropped a video in the Eastern channel. There's this guy that I just discovered on YouTube, and I don't know if he would appreciate this, and I'm sorry if you don't, but I can't think of his name right now. But I dropped his proper name in the channel, but I'm just calling him Grandpa Jack because he called himself that in a recent video, and I'm getting up there too, so it's like, yeah, Grandpa Jack. But he had just dropped a video, about is it normal to hallucinate when you're meditating? Is this normal? Is that normal? And it's like, yeah, it's kind of all normal, whatever that means. When you really take up a serious practice, it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, it probably does for some, again, kind of getting into, I'm sure, what these aspects of Buddhism that I'm very ignorant to are really getting at. And I'm sure, again, I don't talk about Hinduism because I'm too ignorant, but I perhaps am just not at the level in which I have my mind blown like that every time. But I have definitely had my mind blown. So anyway, that's kind of how I am kind of approaching this idea of heaven and hell, and just kind of continuing to try to keep an open mind. And yeah, it's important to note, though, that whereas the Buddha talked about where rebirth can happen, he never discussed the issue of what gets reborn, or by what mechanism the results of action carry over from one lifetime to later lifetimes. After all, you are not responsible for those issues. He did discuss, however, how rebirth happens. As a process, acts of consciousness are sustained by craving as they move from one state to the next. Sutta 59. Just this much information is useful because you are responsible for this process. And it's something that you can aim in the right direction or even end by gaining control over your cravings or putting an end to them by following the Noble Eightfold Path. I just want to check the chat just to make sure that you're not saying anything or asking anything. Right on. Feel free to. And this is great. We were just talking about this last week. I had a guest, and I'm sorry that I can't record guests anymore. It was just I explained earlier in this episode why, but I really did enjoy it. And we were just talking about this very thing, about how we really can train. And I shared it in an earlier episode. I wasn't with my father when he passed away. I wasn't in the room with my father when he passed away, but I was in the room with him many times throughout the dying process. And he was in and out of lucidity, at that point. And I remember thinking often after he passed away, that I just hoped that in his dying moment, whatever that was, that moment of death, if he was awake, in other words, I realize, what server this is, but I mean, in other words, if he wasn't sleeping when he died, if he didn't die in his sleep, and I don't believe he did, then I just hope he had a moment of some kind of I don't know, you hear about this all the time, right? You read about it, you hear about it, that people right before they die, they have a kind of an awe and wondrous moment of just, you definitely can get to that through meditation as well. But I'd always hope for my father that he would get that and I think that at the end of the day, even though I like to say that I struggle with this idea, I've been Buddhist for 25 years, and there is some part of me that was my first thought upon his death. Well, the second thought. The first thought was, oh my gosh, he's finally free. Oh, Dad, I'm just so relieved for you. I'm just so grateful for you that you're finally free. But then my second thought, was, oh man, because there's this part of me, that thinks, man, if he went out hanging on to some aggregate, some habituated thought stream that he wasn't even aware that, I mean, it was, right? We can become so habituated to thought streams that they now are called identity. They now are called who we are, who we think we are. And I just, this is saying right here, we do have some agency here, and this is what we were talking about last week, that this other member of the community, and we were talking about how hopeful that is. I know when I came into Buddhism, I'm trying not to cuss anymore because it alienates some, and I don't want to alienate, but let's just say that if I continue to drop I was effed up when I found Buddhism, as well as kind of getting some recovery from some things. So the idea though that that you could train, is pretty cool. And I sure wish that my father could have found it, before he passed. But that's just not how it was. All right, so we're now getting into everybody's least favorite word in the West, ladies and gentlemen, duties. Yeah, nobody likes that word here. All right, for anyone seeking the end of suffering, the imperatives that follow from mundane right view are simple. Abandon unskillful actions and develop skillful ones. This was one of the only two teachings that the Buddha said were categorical, i.e., true across the board for all people in all times. The only question lies in how to determine what's skillful and what's not. And then following that, how to develop the strength of what's not. And then following that, how to develop the strength of what's not. And then following that, how to develop the strength of character to follow through with that knowledge, to yield either fortunate rebirths or better still, find the way to release. Hello. Hey, hello, friend. Nice to see you. Yeah, we were just talking about this this last week. Yeah, this idea that this is true categorically. Yeah, for all people at all times. Again, it's that idea that, oh my gosh, this is so great. Here's this map. Here's this universal map. Doesn't really get into the detail so much, but more talks about the action emphasis, the Eightfold Path, the action emphasis. Yeah, I'm gonna move on here. The famous Kalami Sutta, Sutta 61, recommends two ways for finding the lines between skillful and unskillful behavior. Number 1, testing a teaching by checking to see what results come from putting it into practice. And 2, consulting the opinions of the wise. So again, this is great. And, again, going back to earlier sections of the book, where the earlier suttas that Bhikkhu references, where he's talking about, the passages where Buddha's talking to his son, and he's explaining this very thing to his son as he's teaching him, as he's raising him, as a father, but really, you can go back and read for yourself, and kind of see what you make of it. The part of the book that talks about the historical Buddha and his relationship to his son and training his son. But yeah, he repeats this sentiment there, that how we know what's skillful, right? How we're able to gauge what's skillful and unskillful is to kind of follow this two-step test, testing a teaching by checking to see what results come from putting it into practice. And so let me give you for instance. I had a hard lesson that is still, I'm still getting the residuals from. I'm still experiencing the fallout from my own bad behavior, my own lack of skillfulness with a particular person. And just to not bore you with the details, but I think context is always very important. This person, there was behavior that I was feeling very triggered by behavior. And I took a particular approach, and I could tell myself that my approach was, I was just being firm. I was being, but if I'm really honest with myself about it, there was an edge to it. Welcome, by the way, hello. There was an edge to it that I was triggered and I was reacting. I wasn't responding. I was reacting. So how did I know that my behavior wasn't skillful? Her reaction. So once again, going back and looking at, I really, I do encourage, if you're reading the book, I really encourage, to go back and read earlier sections, because there's a whole section, again, going back and, when Buddha's training his son and he's teaching his son, and there's a whole section about ethics, where his son's, where he's like, this is why, this is why, this is why skillful, this is why no skillful, this is why. And it's not this kind of preachy, it's very practical, it's very pragmatic, and once again, we get to see Buddha's incredibly profound pragmatism in action once again. So when you meditate, when you actually follow the Eightfold Path and you start to practice right mindfulness, right concentration, right effort, you start to become more sensitive. And we were talking about this last week. Do I have any evidence for this? No. And if you go and you look at earlier sections of the book, Buddha also says, you're never going to win that argument with someone because it is wholly subjective and it's just your opinion. So that's an argument that you can't win. And I don't really feel like dying on that hill. I mean, I don't really need to. I don't need to be right. I just choose to follow the Eightfold Path. That's all I know. I choose to follow the Eightfold Path. But at any rate, he's really clear, that we can train in this stuff. And so we become a little less obtuse about how our behavior is affecting others. And what I've talked about in the past too, about how this particular me, really practical Westerner who grew up in a very secular home. I would even say that my primary, male, I had two kind of father figures, but my biological father figure was a little bit anti-organized religion, so how I negotiate and kind of work with the Buddhism, because I've been in this now for, 25 years, is to try to keep an open mind and have beginner's mind, but, to also think about how I can see how this affects me and others in real time, in real life, or downstream and not too far downstream. And that's just many of the points that the Buddha discussed under mundane right view were unique to him in his time. There is a widespread misunderstanding that he simply picked up his teachings on karma and rebirth from ancient Indian culture, but this is simply not true. In fact, the Buddha often used the teachings of mundane right view to counter many of the views widespread among his contemporaries. Of the many forms of wrong view that he rejected in this way, 6 stand out, both because he argued against them so frequently and because they correspond to wrong views that are still widely held at present: annihilationism, materialism, fatalism, the denial of causality, eternalism, and racism. The Buddha had to counter these views because they either 1, denied the possibility of any path of skillful action leading to the end of suffering, 2, denied the need for such a path, or 3, undermined the motivation needed to stick with the specific path he had discovered and taught. So I'm probably going to mispronounce this because it's a real tongue twister. Annihilationism is the belief that a person, however one might be defined, is annihilated at death and there is no rebirth. The Buddha rejected this belief because he had seen on the night of his awakening that it simply wasn't true. That of course wasn't reason enough to include it in his teachings. After all, as he said in SN 56:31, there were many facts he came to know in the course of his awakening that he didn't teach to others, because those facts would have served no purpose toward putting an end to suffering. But a belief in rebirth would serve such a purpose. Even though the Buddha never tried to provide an empirical proof of rebirth, he did provide a pragmatic proof for why a person seeking to develop the skills needed to put an end to suffering should reject annihilationism as a working hypothesis. If you don't believe that the results of action can carry over into another life, you can find in the present life plenty of examples of unskillful actions leading to pleasant results here and now. Sutta 67. These would undercut any desire to adopt skillfulness as a constant principle, particularly in cases where a skillful action might endanger your health, wealth, or life. And so I'll just stop there really quick, just to say that how I line this up with my preface, and again, I constantly get to do the mental gymnastics of the notion of karma, but if you really believe that this is it, that we die, and not to be graphic, but, unless something massive happens with technology, we're all going to die and our, I'll just say a trigger warning here perhaps, but, our body's going to rot, that's it, it's, and then that's it, and then that's it. right? And so when you hold that view, well, that could potentially be a quite a dangerous view, especially if you also hold the view of some of these other wrong views that we're going to get to later. So much like the Eightfold Path isn't like a procedural process. First you do one, then you do two. And in the introduction in chapter 1, Bhikkhu is providing the context of that. Buddha talks about this idea of that they worked kind of with each other. Well, these wrong views also kind of work together, that you couple this idea of not believing that there's anything else with, some of the things that we're going to be looking at later. And if you don't want to look at it from a quote unquote moral or ethical standpoint, then maybe look at it from a practical, strategic standpoint. Well, that could be the recipe for the demise of Homo sapien. So I'll just stop talking to make sure that there's time if anybody else wants to comment on. We didn't quite get through all of it, but at least we got the setup for annihilationism.
Honestly, I used to adopt the belief of rebirth because it made me feel released, feel better, or I don't know. It released me from some kind of limitation to my emotion. But after a while, I don't believe in rebirth anymore, because not because of unskillful approach in all situation it might bring, but because I feel other source of meaning, honestly. But
Yeah.
I believe that everybody have different. Everybody, we are different, right?
Yeah.
So we adopt different belief for which align, which more aligned to our own nature.
Yeah.
I
appreciate your
come
open
back
mind.
on rebirth.
Yeah.
I don't know, but there is a time in the past, just belief in rebirth give me more sense of living. But after a while, the energy, the sense of living come to my inner space, rather than inner space in this life, rather than believe in other life. I believe that everybody have a good nature in themselves, and in myself too. So I just do good thing and skillful thing because I want it to happen, and it will encourage the same skillful thought action in other. If so I don't need the concept of next life to do a skillful action at the moment. I think so. I kind of disagree on this belief of Buddhism.
I completely hear you. I mean, this was a tough one for me because, again, I as we were talking about before, if I haven't seen it for myself, it's really hard for me to believe it. So I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
And
basically his reason is that belief in rebirth is only reason it's the reason you do right action, you develop and do skillful action, because it will give some kind of bad result, bad causation for your next life, or your far end of your current life. I don't think it's a good thing to believe. I think
that's always been really hard for me too. And It reminds me of aspects of what has been done to the organized religion of Christianity or Catholicism, to my view, where not all, but right there can be a mental construct, like you're saying, there can be a mental construct of, well, you don't actually have to feel any remorse or shame in your heart. You can just give some Hail Marys or go talk to a guy in a box and say what you did, and you're all good because somebody died on the cross for you, so you're golden. There's kind of having this intermediary, which, like you said, I think is a natural storytelling device if you've come up in it. It can be a nightmare if you came up in it and it burned you. Like, in other words, if you've come up in a particular religion where there were aspects of the religious doctrine that maybe were traumatic, and then it becomes, and this to me is the saddest story, where, like, as just from a psychological perspective, going back just to, like, Buddhism reference here, that urgency that Buddha talks about all of the time, that that he wouldn't even teach people, he wouldn't even take students who didn't have that sense of urgency. And how do people aren't going to feel, you don't get a sense of urgency by just teaching people that they can say a bunch of Hail Marys, or I think if we could really just teach people how to really cultivate what shame really feels like in the heart. And I think shame has become such a bad word. Like, I grew up with a tremendous amount of self-shame, and it's been a Herculean lift, to work in progress, to continue to work with my relationship to shame. I especially think if you grow up in a home where you're told repeatedly that you're getting it wrong, doing it wrong, well, then you do grow up with the message with, you are wrong and you are not getting it right. And so now you have kind of some fabricated conditioning, there's that aggregate there that you get to kind of work with and negotiate and play with. But I really do wish, though, that, we could, I love what you said. We don't, you said, I don't really know that I need the concept of rebirth. And for me, the concept of rebirth never was a natural lift. But I do feel like, and again, feel free to, I don't know, I don't think anything's planned after this. I don't want to get into somebody else's time. But I do feel like humans, we do need some kind of a trick, a mechanism, that can help us want it, that will produce within us that urgency, that inner fire, that inner resolve that Buddha talks about all the time, sitting and meditating, even when your mind is on fire, going back and looking at the introduction, the mind is on fire. And the Eightfold Path is just a map to the firescape. Well, that takes incredible resolve. I think it's why most people quit. It's why they stop practicing right concentration and right mindfulness, because it's hard, to do that on a regular basis. But I think it's not hard when you have urgency, a sense of urgency.
So the belief in rebirth gives them an urgency.
Well, I don't really believe in it. I have a sense of urgency because I'm a recovering junkie, and I see how my unskillful behavior just left a path of, of metaphorical dead bodies in my wake, and and through meditation, really seeing clearly. And it wasn't just Buddhism for me on that level. It was, I'm just going to say it, that I was in a 12-step program for 2 decades, two. One was a different one. So I did a lot of journaling. In a 12-step program, there's a step called the 4th step. And that's basically where you get in there and you really unpack all the things. So, and what I actually likened the fourth step to Buddhism in a couple episodes ago, and it would really be what when Buddha's talking about with his son, this idea of reflect on your, he's saying just reflect on your behavior, son. Look, just think, sit down and think about what is this getting you, and so when you reflect, like let's say that I would imagine that if someone who was a very violent person who caused a lot of physical harm, they're asleep, right? I'm assuming, that's my opinion. I'm guessing they're asleep. I don't know. Maybe they are not. I don't know. But I will say that if they have this, for whatever reason they develop, or it just happens, grace, whatever, there's people call it different things. He just develops this urgency, to practice. Well, he could completely transform his life. I mean, you hear about that happening in prisons all the time. People go in there, for killing someone, and they come out awake, because they had the urgency, they had some fire, and I have to, yeah. So, I see people coming on. I probably should go. I just saw the time. Bye. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Have a nice, good night, I think, I guess.
Thank you. You too. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.